On October 10, 1846, when they broke down the door to Marcus's cabin at Magnolia Heights Plantation in Alabama, what they found inside shouldn't have existed. Catherine Winthrop, wife of one of the state's wealthiest planters, queen of Alabama high society, a woman who commanded servants with a lifted finger, was on her knees wearing a slave's collar with chains locked around her wrists. But that wasn't the worst part. The journal they discovered documented 8 years of nights when Catherine had crawled to this cabin, begging an enslaved man to dominate her, use her, treat her like property. And the photographs, dear God, the daguerreotypes showed positions, acts, and degradations that would shatter every foundation of Southern society. By the time authorities finished reading that journal, they knew 3 things for certain. Catherine Winthrop had been spying on her own husband for nearly a decade, passing business secrets to the slave Marcus. 13 of Alabama's most powerful plantation owners had been systematically destroyed by information Catherine provided. And most shocking of all, Catherine's 2-year-old son, the heir to the Winthrop fortune, wasn't her husband's child at all. What really happened between Catherine Winthrop and the man she called Master? How did a Southern belle from one of Alabama's finest families end up as the willing slave of her own property? And why, when Marcus disappeared that September night, did he leave behind evidence that would expose not just Catherine's betrayal, but a conspiracy that reached all the way to Northern abolitionists planning to tear the South apart? Before we uncover this twisted story of obsession, manipulation, and revenge, subscribe right now. Hit that bell and comment your state below, because what you're about to hear will disturb you in ways you never imagined. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. Mobile, Alabama, spring of 1832. A 17-year-old girl named Catherine Ashford is about to make a decision that will destroy her life and reshape her soul in ways she cannot yet comprehend. The slave auction in Mobile's market square stank of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and desperation. Catherine Ashford stood beside her father, a lace handkerchief pressed to her nose, watching human beings get examined like livestock. She'd seen slaves her whole life. They were everywhere in the South, invisible as furniture, part of the landscape like pine trees and red clay. But when they brought Marcus onto that platform, something inside Catherine cracked open. He was maybe 25, powerfully built, with eyes that held something Catherine had never seen in a slave before. Not fear, not submission, something else. Something that made heat flood her body and her breath catch in her throat, in a way she didn't understand but felt in every nerve. The auctioneer was explaining Marcus's history. Born free in Charleston, his daddy was a blacksmith, made good money, but when the old man died, a creditor claimed debts nobody could verify. Judge ruled the son gets sold to pay what's owed. The auctioneer grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. This one fought back, resisted, needs breaking in proper, but look at that body. Strong as an ox, can read and write, do figures, make an excellent house servant once you teach him his place. Catherine's father showed no interest. They didn't need more workers, and this one's reputation for resistance made him dangerous, a troublemaker who'd already been through 3 owners in 2 years. But Catherine couldn't look away. When Marcus's eyes swept across the crowd and met hers, something passed between them. Recognition. Challenge. Something Catherine didn't have words for but felt in her bones like a tuning fork vibrating at a frequency only she could hear. The bidding was slow. Nobody wanted a troublesome slave who might inspire resistance in others, who carried himself like he still believed he was free. A trader from Mississippi placed a low bid, planning to resell Marcus out west, where discipline was harsher, and a man could be broken through violence and isolation. The auctioneer was about to close the sale when Catherine surprised everyone, especially herself. "Here." "Father," she said quietly, her hand on James Ashford's arm. "Buy him." Her father frowned. "Catherine, we don't need another." "Buy him," she repeated, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, her eyes still locked on Marcus. Every plantation mistress needs a personal servant, someone loyal to her alone. I want him. James Ashford was wealthy enough to indulge his only daughter, especially on small matters like purchasing a single slave. He bid, won, and Marcus became property of the Ashford household, with Catherine designated as his specific mistress. What happened next took place slowly, over months, in the gray spaces between the public performance of Southern society and the private reality of what people actually wanted, actually needed. actually craved when all the masks came off. Catherine didn't understand herself. She'd been raised to be a perfect Southern lady, educated in music and French and needlework, trained to manage a household and someday marry well, and produce heirs who would continue the aristocratic bloodlines that ruled the South. But from the first day Marcus entered her father's house, something in Catherine began to change. She gave him tasks that kept him near her. She invented reasons to speak with him, to be in his presence. And Marcus, for his part, watched her with those eyes that saw everything, that understood more than he should, that recognized something in Catherine she didn't yet recognize in herself. The summer Catherine turned 18, her father hosted a garden party. The finest families in Mobile attended. Catherine wore white lace and smiled at the sons of planters who competed for her attention. She was playing the role perfectly, the beautiful daughter, the prize waiting to be claimed by the right man from the right family. But that evening, after the guests departed, something broke. Catherine found Marcus in the servant quarters, dismissed the other slaves, and closed the door. What happened in that room wasn't rape. That's important to understand. The power dynamics were impossibly complex, tangled in ways that make simple moral judgments meaningless. Catherine was white, wealthy, legally his owner. But Marcus was the one who understood power, who'd been forced to study it his whole life, who knew its mechanisms and its theater in ways Catherine never could. She came to him begging, not commanding, begging, asking him to do something she couldn't articulate but needed with a desperation that terrified her. And Marcus, after a long silence, after watching this girl tremble and plead, made a choice that would define both their lives. He said no. He told Catherine to leave. He explained with a coldness that shocked her that he wouldn't be her experiment, her rebellion, her way of feeling dangerous while remaining safe. If she wanted to cross this line, if she wanted to explore the darkness she felt inside herself, then she needed to understand what it meant. She needed to surrender completely. Not her body, anyone could surrender a body. She needed to surrender her will, her identity, her sense of who she was and who she was allowed to be. She needed to become his property in ways that went far deeper than legal documents. Catherine left that room shaking. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed in her father's house, surrounded by everything that defined her life and her future, and she understood with horrible clarity that Marcus had seen something in her she'd been hiding from herself. A need for submission so profound it violated everything her society said a woman, especially a white woman, should be. 3 weeks later, Catherine came to Marcus again. This time, she didn't beg. She knelt. She placed herself at his feet and offered him something no white woman in Alabama had ever offered a slave: complete control. Not just sexually, though that would come, but control over her secrets, her loyalty, her very identity. Marcus accepted, but he set conditions that revealed the depth of his intelligence and his understanding of power. He told Catherine that what they were beginning wasn't love, wasn't romance, wasn't even primarily about sex. It was about power exchange in its purest form. And if she entered this arrangement, there would be no safety, no limits beyond what he decided, no returning to who she'd been before. Catherine agreed. And that night, in a slave cabin on her father's property, Catherine Ashford began a transformation that would take 8 years to complete. What Catherine and Marcus created together wasn't an affair. It was a complete inversion of the power structure that defined their entire world. And understanding this requires you to let go of conventional morality for a moment and recognize something most people never want to acknowledge. That power, real power, exists in the mind before it exists anywhere else. That dominance and submission aren't always what they appear to be. And that sometimes the person wearing chains is the one truly in control of their own narrative. Marcus never beat Catherine, never forced her, never violated her consent. What he did was far more sophisticated. He trained her, using techniques that predated any modern understanding of psychology. Marcus systematically rewired Catherine's identity. He gave her tasks, rituals, protocols that had to be performed exactly. He made her maintain a journal documenting every encounter, every thought, every desire. He required her to confess her daily life, her interactions with her family and society, turning her world into a performance she analyzed through his eyes. And slowly, methodically, Marcus transformed Catherine from a plantation mistress into something else entirely. His spy, his agent, his weapon against the system that had enslaved him. This is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because Marcus wasn't just dominating Catherine for personal satisfaction. He was using their arrangement to gather intelligence, to understand the inner workings of Alabama's planter class, to identify vulnerabilities and secrets and leverage points that could be exploited. Catherine, lost in her submission, in the ecstatic surrender of her will, became his perfect intelligence asset. She attended parties, dinner parties where wealthy men drank too much and spoke too freely. She visited other plantations with her father, observing, listening, remembering. She cultivated friendships with other planters' wives and daughters, women who trusted her because she was one of them, who shared confidences about their husbands' business dealings, their financial troubles, their affairs, and indiscretion. And every piece of information Catherine gathered, she brought back to Marcus. Kneeling in his cabin, wearing the chains he'd commissioned from a blacksmith using her own money, she would confess everything she'd learned. Marcus took notes. He kept meticulous records hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin, and slowly over months and then years, he built a comprehensive map of Alabama's elite, their weaknesses, their secrets, their crimes. In 1835, Catherine married Thomas Winthrop, a match arranged by her father that consolidated two plantation fortunes and elevated Catherine's social position. Thomas was 42, recently widowed, possessed of a cold demeanor and colder business practices. And the marriage was loveless, but Catherine performed her role perfectly. She managed Thomas's household, hosted his guests, smiled at his side during social functions, and fulfilled her duties in his bed with efficient detachment. But 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, Catherine would leave the main house after Thomas fell asleep. She would walk across the grounds of Magnolia Heights, the plantation Thomas had brought to the marriage, and she would go to Marcus. Thomas had purchased Marcus from Catherine's father as part of the marriage settlement, never suspecting that he was bringing his wife's master into his own home. The journal documented everything, not just the sexual acts, though those were described in detail that would shock even modern readers, but the complete psychological architecture of Catherine's submission. The rules Marcus established, the punishments when Catherine failed to meet his standards, the rewards when she excelled, and woven through it all the intelligence work, the information Catherine gathered and provided. The way Marcus used that information to subtly manipulate events, destroying Thomas's business rivals, undermining other planters, creating chaos in Alabama's agricultural economy that benefited a network Marcus had been building since before Catherine entered his life. Now we've reached the halfway point, and before we go deeper into how this all collapsed, before I reveal what Marcus was really doing and who he was working with, I need you to do something. In the comments right now, type these exact words twice. I choose to see clearly. Type it twice. This phrase isn't random. It's a declaration that you're willing to look at uncomfortable truths, that you're choosing awareness over the comfortable illusions most people prefer. Type, I choose to see clearly twice in the comments. Do it now. Because what comes next requires you to completely abandon the simple narratives you've been taught about power, about resistance, about who has agency in systems of oppression. Marcus wasn't just using Catherine. He was part of something larger, something that would eventually terrify the South far more than any slave rebellion. He was connected to Northern abolitionists, yes, but not the gentle Quakers you learned about in school. He was part of a radical network that believed the South could only be destroyed from within by corrupting its leaders, exposing its hypocrisies, and turning its own people against each other. The information Catherine provided didn't just hurt individual planters. It was being compiled, analyzed, and used to identify which Southern leaders could be blackmailed, which could be financially ruined, which could be turned into unwitting agents of chaos. Between 1835 and 1843, 13 major plantation owners in Alabama suffered catastrophic reversals. Some lost fortunes through bad investments that seemed like sure things. Others were exposed in scandals that destroyed their reputations. And 2 were murdered in ways that appeared random but weren't. And all of it traced back in ways no one suspected until that journal was discovered, to information Catherine Winthrop had gathered and Marcus had weaponized. But Catherine wasn't a victim in this. That's what makes this story so complex, so disturbing. She knew what Marcus was doing. The journal makes that clear. She understood that the intelligence she was providing was being used to destroy people she knew, families she'd grown up alongside, and she continued anyway. Because her submission to Marcus had become more important to her than her loyalty to her own society, her own class, even her own family. This is the part that terrifies people when they really think about it. Catherine had every privilege the South could offer a white woman. Wealth, status, security, respect, and she chose to betray all of it, to risk everything, for the sake of a power dynamic that existed primarily in her own mind. She could have stopped at any time. Marcus couldn't force her to continue. He was still legally her property, still subject to being sold or killed if she chose. But Catherine didn't want to stop. She wanted to go deeper. In 1845, Catherine became pregnant. She knew the child was Marcus's. The timing made Thomas's paternity impossible. And here's where Catherine made her most dangerous gamble. She carried the child to term, gave birth to a son, and presented him to Thomas as his heir. The boy was light-skinned enough to pass, his features ambiguous enough to avoid immediate suspicion. And Thomas, eager for a son after years of failed attempts with his first wife, accepted the child without question. Catherine had just secured her slave's bloodline as the inheritor of one of Alabama's great fortunes. Think about the audacity of that. The absolute commitment to betrayal it required. So this wasn't a moment of passion or a mistake. This was calculated, deliberate. A woman making a choice to elevate her master's child above her husband, her family, her entire society. So what happened? How did it all unravel? The answer is both simple and revealing. Marcus chose to end it. In September 1847, Marcus made contact with his abolitionist network and told them he was done. He'd gathered enough information, he'd done enough damage, and continuing meant Catherine would eventually be discovered and killed, because the surveillance was tightening, the suspicions growing. Other planters had noticed the pattern of failures, the concentration of catastrophes among certain families. They hadn't identified the source yet, but they were getting close. Marcus made a decision. He would disappear, escape north using routes the network had established. But he would leave behind the journal and the evidence, not to destroy Catherine, but to create a scandal so massive it would distract authorities while he escaped and simultaneously exposed the rot at the heart of Alabama's planter class. He told Catherine 3 days before he left. The journal describes that final meeting. Catherine begged him to take her with him. Marcus refused. He explained, with the same cold clarity he'd used when they began, that her role was to remain behind, to face the consequences of what they'd done together, to become the symbol that would force the South to confront its own contradictions. Catherine understood. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she only thought she understood. Maybe the depth of betrayal, of being abandoned by the man she'd surrendered everything to, was something she couldn't fully process. When they found her in Marcus's cabin 3 days later, wearing chains and collar, the journal open beside her, Catherine didn't resist. She didn't deny anything. She confirmed it all in detail, before a magistrate who could barely comprehend what he was hearing. The trials lasted months. Catherine was convicted of adultery, conspiracy, treason against the state of Alabama. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, but died of fever in 1849, before serving 2 years, possibly by her own hand, through deliberately neglecting her health. Thomas Winthrop divorced her posthumously, a legal fiction to protect his property from being seized. He acknowledged the boy wasn't his son but chose to raise him anyway, a decision that baffled contemporaries but revealed something about Thomas's own complicated relationship with power and legacy. Marcus was never captured. He vanished completely, presumed to have reached Canada or possibly died during escape. The abolitionist network he'd been part of was partially exposed through Catherine's testimony, but most escaped prosecution. The 13 families Catherine and Marcus destroyed never fully recovered. Some lost everything and faded into poverty. Others rebuilt but never regained their former influence. And the scandal, the sheer impossibility of what Catherine Winthrop had done, echoed through Alabama society for decades, a whispered warning about the dangers of ungoverned female sexuality and the necessity of total control over the enslaved population. But here's what history doesn't want you to understand. Catherine and Marcus weren't aberrations. They were examples of something that happened more often than anyone admits. The boundaries between slave and master, between white and black, between power and submission, were always more permeable, more complex, more psychologically tangled than the official story allows. Systems of total control create inversions. People in chains sometimes possess freedom in their minds that their masters never experience, and the assumption that legal power equals actual power, that ownership equals control, is often a comforting delusion that collapses when pressure is applied. Catherine Winthrop spent 8 years on her knees before a man she legally owned. She betrayed her family, her class, her entire society for the sake of submission to someone the world said was her inferior. And in doing so, she exposed the central lie of the South slave system, that power flows naturally from white to black, from master to slave, from man to woman. Marcus understood what few people ever grasp, that real power exists in the mind, that someone willing to surrender everything can become dangerous precisely because they have nothing left to protect, and that systems built on lies, on pretending that social hierarchies reflect natural law, are vulnerable to anyone brave enough or broken enough to stop pretending. The journal still exists, sealed in an archive in Montgomery, available only to researchers with special permission. The photographs were destroyed, though descriptions survive in court records. Catherine's son lived to old age, died in 1902, never knowing his true father. And Marcus, if he survived, if he made it north, left no trace beyond the intelligence network he'd helped build and the chaos he'd orchestrated across Alabama. This is the story they don't teach, the one that complicates every simple narrative about slavery, about power, about resistance and complicity. Catherine Winthrop wasn't a hero. Neither was Marcus. They were two people who found each other in a system that said their connection was impossible, and they burned that system from within through a relationship that shouldn't have existed. You've made it to the end. You've chosen to see clearly. Now you carry this knowledge. Now you understand something about power that most people never grasp. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs their assumptions challenged. And remember, the chains people wear aren't always visible, and the people wearing them aren't always who you'd expect.